Aha.
Oh, I see custom live streaming service now.
Okay.
And it does say meeting is now streaming live.
All right, guys, I believe we are live.
Yep, we are.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kamrul Khan. I serve on an organization called Bengalis of New York. We highlight people, stories, and issues that are important to the Bengali diaspora. And I can't think of an issue more important than what we're going to talk about today, which is the Rohingya refugee crisis. Uh, Neeraj and I have done a lot of research, watched a lot of documentaries the last few days, learned a lot, but also just have a ton more questions from that. And we have an esteemed panel that we'll be talking with today. But my co-moderator, I'll turn it over to him, Neeraj.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Good morning, wherever you're tuning in from across the world. My name is Neeraj Maheshwari. I'm one of the Asana Voices team members. Asana Voices is a group that addresses social justice issues that pertain to the South Asian community across North America, across the world. So thank you for that introduction, Kamro. We do have three amazing panelists here today. Thank you all for being here. And I want to take a quick moment just to introduce each of you. First, we have Shahira. Shahira Majumdar is a writer, journalist, and researcher. She's been working in Cox's Bazar since September of 2017, where she first began reporting on the Rohingya refugee crisis for Vice Media. She's currently editor-in-chief of the Rohingya Cultural Memory Center, in Cox's Bazar, and a foreign returned Bengali American. She splits her time between Bangladesh and New York City. So thank you, Shahira, for being here. We also have with us today Zafar Shoban. Zafar is the editor of Dhaka Tribune, which was founded in 2013. As a longtime columnist, he also has to his name numerous articles, features, interviews, and essays in publications including the New York Times, The Guardian, Time, Vice, Himal, Political Weekly, Outlook, and Seminar. Previously, he served as editor of the Monthly Forum magazine and opinions editor of the Daily Star. He was selected as Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum in 2005 and as a Yale World Fellow in 2009. Thank you, Zafar, for being here today. And last but not least, we have Fares. Fares Puyan is a Bangladeshi American economist specializing in development, labor, and happiness economics. After getting his PhD from Northwestern, he joined Carleton College in Minnesota, where he is an associate professor of economics. He is also the founder and president of Nourish Bangladesh, which is a multinational volunteer-driven nonprofit that rigorously vets and fundraises for NGOs and grassroots groups who fight hunger within Bangladesh. He's married to his best friend Ria and is the proud father of two boys, Wali and Raphael. Thanks for being here. So without further ado, just like Kamral was saying, this is such an important issue. As Indian American, we've gotten glimpses of this story for many years, but very tangentially. And so with such an esteemed group of panelists today, people who have unique perspectives on this issue, we just have a whole lot of questions for you, and we'll try to get through as much content as we can over the next hour or so. So without further ado, I'll start with Shahira. And our first question is, who are the Rohingya? Shahira, I think you're muted.
Okay.
I think now we should be able to hear you. Everything okay on your end?
Okay, kids, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I think there's something going on with my Zoom. I'm hearing us in the moment, but then also like a couple minutes back.
Oh, is it echoing?
Okay, now I'm hearing. Okay, now I'm hearing myself speaking from a few seconds ago. How do I don't know how to stop that.
It might have been because I was not muted, so I'll go ahead and mute myself.
Okay. Okay, so everything is like being repeated a little bit later. And now I can hear myself. So the question, it's very distracting because I start talking and then I hear myself from like 30 seconds back, or I hear whoever was talking. Is anybody else having this problem?
We haven't spoken yet. You may want to put down the earphone and speak, and then see what happens.
Sorry. Okay. Okay. Okay, so should I go ahead and answer the question now?
Yes, sorry about that.
This is not. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry, guys. This is not working for me. I think I'm gonna have to exit and come back in. Okay.
That's fine. Well, how about Faraz? How about you take that question?
All right, I'm happy to. I will kind of warn the audience ahead of time. I'm very bad with dates, so I may get a few things wrong. So when it comes to who are the Rohingya, or some people call them Rohingya, it actually, interestingly, is a question of who you are asking. And that might be an unfortunate thing in the current context. But if you think about who they are, there are different versions. The version that comes from from the Burmese and perhaps the Burmese nationalists who don't want them there, their version would be when the Brits took over parts of Burma, and they took over the Rakhine state and that region. They basically didn't find enough people to work for them, to farm for them, to kind of work in their different farms that they had. So they brought in a lot of people from East India. So back in the days, there was East Pakistan, right, which is Bangladesh, and India. And you put it all together, you have East India. So a lot of those people were brought in from there. And from their version, they would basically say, well, they were migrants who came after 1824. Okay, so they were brought in after 1824. And so in that sense, that's who the Rohingyas are. Now, on the other hand, if you ask a lot of the Bangladeshi scholars and people who are on the side of Rohingya saying, no, they have a root there, they will take you back all the way to anywhere between 9th and the 14th century. And they will say a lot of these Muslims were indigenous to that area. You had a lot of global trade happening roughly around the 14th century, where you would have the Persians, the Portuguese, and the Dutch coming into that region. And the Portuguese and the Dutch would often bring their slaves from East Asia And a lot of them would have been brought in. And a lot of the traders, the Persians and the Arabs, they would also come in there, and some of them would settle and marry and kind of settle there for a while. So when you bring that perspective, you would say that the Rohingya, the people that we are currently calling Rohingya, or the Rohingya refugees, these individuals were there in what we call the Arkan state way back in the days. They were there for a very long time. So then the question becomes, what is the truth? And the truth is, as I said early on, it is a question of who you ask. It is a question who you ask. And I think while there is a lot of academic curiosity as to who they are, we should not forget that in either version, whichever version you take, we're talking about people staying there for about 200 years. That nobody's questioning. So people may be, certain individuals may say, hey, look, they came after 1824. They came here after the Brits brought them in. Others are saying, no, look, they were there from the 9th century, 10th century, 14th century. But one thing that's common in both of those descriptions is they've been possibly here for at least 200 years. And if you tell me that a group has been in an area living for about 200 years, that's, 6, 7, 8, 9 generations, I think at that point we should stop and say, well, we have some ideas of who the Rohingyas may be, but perhaps that's not the right question to ask. The question to ask is, what do you want to do with that answer? Are you going to use that answer to say, now let's push them back out of the country and call them migrants? And if that is the aim, I would say that's just a really weird way of thinking about the whole thing, to throw a group of people away from a country, even when you're admitting potentially they've been here for 200 years. So it's a roundabout way of answering that, but hopefully that gives you some feel for it.
Yeah, thanks for that history. I think that's important context to know. I am curious, and this question is for Zafar. I'm curious why has the persecution of Rohingyas been in the news recently? Was there a specific event, or what caused them to be in the news recently? And when I mean recently, last 4 to 5 years.
Sure. If I could actually just add something to Faris's earlier answer. I mean, I think the way it seems to me, if you look at it historically, you have the kingdom of Arakan, and then, going way back to, I think it was the 16th century, the Sultanate of Bengal, the border between what is currently Bangladesh and what is currently Myanmar has, shifted historically. And I think it's natural that, people have shifted as that has happened. And of course, when hard borders are drawn, like with the withdrawal of the British after their colonial rule in this part of the world, some people would naturally find themselves ethnically on the quote unquote wrong side of the line. But I think the point Faris raises is the perfect one. We have ethnic Rakhines living in Bangladesh in the Chittagong Hill Tracts predominantly, but as Bangladeshi citizens, of course, they are entitled to live anywhere they wish. And I think no one in Bangladesh would argue that just by the fact that they're ethnically Rakhine, they're not as Bangladeshi is I or anyone else living in Bangladesh. It's, I think that's the point. Just because someone may belong to an ethnic minority in their roots may be elsewhere from where they are right now should not strip them of their citizenship and their rights. Now, getting back to Kamrul's point about why is this in the news? I mean, what we had happen, I think it was 2017, is now there's been a low-level, it's not actually low-level, but there's been, a fairly steady persecution of the Rohingya, really since, if you want to date it, in its current form since the end of the Second World War, and Burma, now Myanmar, becoming an independent state. In the refugee crisis, Rohingya coming over to Bangladesh, that picked up steam first in the early 70s, and throughout the 1990s there was another wave. So we had a couple of 100,000 Rohingyas living in camps in Bangladesh prior to 2017. And of course, there are Rohingya all over the world. There are many in Pakistan, there are many in Saudi Arabia. There are some, I think, in Southeast Asia, countries like Malaysia. But what happened in 2017 is essentially there was a pogrom. Now, this happened ostensibly in response to an attack on Burmese police and military outposts. But, I think by any definition, the response of the Burmese army was massively disproportionate. And a lot of people have argued that, that essentially they were using these incidents as an excuse to ethnically cleanse the Rohingya from Rakhine State. And, it was a tremendous ethnic cleansing. I mean, I think there's really no other word for it. We have, I think, up to 750,000 people, men, women, children who were, essentially forced out of their homes and across the border. And so that's really in recent history where the current crisis begins. And of course, now we have, we have probably over 1 million Rohingya in and around the Cox's Bazar, Teknaf area in Bangladesh. The couple of 100,000 who were there before, and the 750,000 who have been forcibly, essentially moved over since 2017. So that's why it is in the media right now. It's been described as the greatest humanitarian crisis of current time. Perhaps in very, very recent times, it has started to be overshadowed by the Uyghur crisis in China. But we shouldn't forget that it's an ongoing crisis here in Bangladesh for these refugees, for these Rohingya. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem as though any solution is on the cards, any realistic solution to return them to what is actually their home.
So, Zafar, you go ahead.
Sure.
Go ahead.
So I want to very quickly add something to what Jafar said as well.
Sure.
Two other things to keep in mind with the 2017 is the sheer number. So in the past, we had a few of these situations where we had about roughly 230,000 people move to Bangladesh. Later, they were repatriated back, and again, another time, another 200,000. So 700,000 in terms of that numbers is bigger. You have to also keep in mind social media is much stronger these days, way more back compared to even a decade back, or if you go back 2 decades. And then in terms of satellite imagery and that kind of stuff, we were literally able to see a bunch of villages burned down. So when you put those kind of hard facts with social media and the size of the exodus, I think it explains why the world kind of took notice this time, way more than, say, back in the days.
That's a great point, bringing the global attention onto the situation. And even Zafar, you were mentioning about the persecution by the Burmese army, this forced exodus, and putting it very bluntly and honestly, a very deliberate form of ethnic cleansing. So my next question is for Shahira, and that is, why are the Rohingya considered citizens of nowhere?
Okay, sorry about the technical problem earlier. I'm back, and everything seems good now. So I would say that to kind of tie together the earlier question and the one that you're asking now, the Rohingya, politically, they're characterized by three things. One is that they're Muslim, and they're not all Muslim, but majority Muslim. They speak a language that is a non-Burmese language. It's a Sanskrit language. It's about 70% similar to Bengali, and ethnically, they are they're brown skinned. You could say that ethnically they're brown people. They're non kind of Chinese Burman, and so what's happened in Myanmar is that citizenship in 1982 a citizenship law was passed that made citizenship exclusive to people of 135 ethnicities, which are grouped into eight national races. So Burma is a country Myanmar. I shouldn't say Burma. The Rohingya, they actually say Burma. So if you talk to the people in the community, in the camps, they don't say Rakhine, they say Arakan, and they don't say Myanmar, they say Burma. So they are not one of those 135 races. And so the pathway to citizenship was shut off for them at that point. And that meant that their children, and children born to somebody who was stateless, who didn't have, Burmese citizenship, would then also become stateless. And there was no pathway, and there has been no pathway opened up for them to then become citizens, or at least not one that wouldn't require enormous amounts of paperwork. And very stringent requirements, and also big bribes being paid to government officials. And so I was saying earlier, that politically, there is a Rohingya identity, right? And that Rohingya identity is, within the Burmese, construct, very much the other. They're seen to be outside of what it means to be part of the Burmese nation. And this happens everywhere around the world. You then have, vested interests, trying to distract from economic problems, political problems in the country by stigmatizing, by vilifying a group like the Rohingya and other minority groups across the country, but specifically the Rohingya, because they are kind of an easy target because they speak a different language, because they are Muslim, and so kind of tapping into those primal fears about the Muslim hordes taking over this peaceful Buddhist nation. I don't know if anybody wants to jump into that and add anything to what I've said.
I tend to talk quite a bit, so feel free to cut me off. Just letting you know, that's one of my problems. But I think one thing to keep in mind about the Rohingyas is that they have kind of fought against the nation of Burma or aligned with the Brits in certain times, and so that we have to kind of remember that part of the history. So when the Brits are kind of expanding into Rakhine state, right, in that area, and a lot of the migrants are kind of coming with them from East India. Now, remember, there is argument about whether those East Indians were from Arakan to begin with and were driven out and by the Burman king, and then they came back in. So that's a different story. But when the Brits went in, they actually put in power these individuals from East India, or currently the Rohingyas. So the rest of Myanmar, they were not happy about that. You have somebody encroaching into your land, and then they are using these individuals or a certain ethnic group in your country who are working with them. And this shows up later as well when you have the Japanese fighting with the Brits during the Second World War. So the Japanese actually come in and take a good portion of Myanmar, and these Rohingyas actually line up with, or this group, they line up, they work with the Brits to fight back. And some would say that the Aung San, actually the father of the nation for Myanmar, he for a while actually shook hands with the fascist idea of Japanese for a bit, quickly to learn this is probably not the best thing to do. And then right after independence, when the Brits left, and unfortunately, as much as I love that country, they have been the root of some problems across a lot of these areas around the world. When they left, it was an understanding that the Arakan region was going to become potentially an autonomous place. And they actually rose up and they said, we want autonomy, we want it to be our place. You can imagine the Myanmar government or the country not being happy about that either. So when you put those into context, they're the other part that Shahriar was saying is completely correct. That's how they're kind of thought of as. And they wanted to annex themselves to Bangladesh. Then they wanted to form their autonomous region. All of that did not really help. And so later, when you have the coup of 1962 and they took over, they were thinking about it like, okay, we are not going to call them part of Myanmar, because first of all, they're acting like migrants. Second of all, they were working with the Brits. third of all, when we did, break up and get our independence, they wanted their own state. They wanted to be part of Bangladesh. All of that is not something that sat well with them. And so that's why the persecution has been happening for a very long time. I mean, there's a reason we call them the most persecuted people in the history of the world. So they've been persecuted for, about 60, 70 years. And that's where a lot of the hatred comes. Now, there were indigenous Muslim peoples who lived there who are not Rohingyas, but currently some of those nationalist Buddhist individual people, they're actually lumping together all the Muslims. But the locals do make a distinction between some of those indigenous Muslims who are not part of the Rohingya. So there's quite a bit of complicated thing, and we should be careful not to kind of all of a sudden say all of the Burmese nationals are wrong on this, or they have no reason to find themselves to be slightly different from them. Of course, none of that justifies ethnic cleansing. Nothing justifies ethnic cleansing. But you can see where it kind of got started as well. It was not a happy marriage kind of going all the way to when the Brits left. Kamrul, your microphone is not on.
Sorry. So I think one thing you both bring up that's common among all history instances of persecution, which is increase in nationalism coupled with finding this common enemy, which sounds like that's happened in Myanmar. One thing I wanted to, and I'll open it up to anyone that wants to answer this, is Zafar talked about the military strike in 2017. One of the defense for the current prime minister is that in a country like Myanmar, she really doesn't have control over the military. It's just like a country like, for example, the President of the United States has a control of the military. What would you say to that defense, of the military or strike or any sort of criticism against the Prime Minister of Myanmar?
I can take this, I suppose. I mean, I think it is a very complicated political calculus for Aung San. Okay, she has a very tenuous and precarious hold on power, and of course, the military is always there. And I think she has made the cold political calculus that if one were to have a referendum on this issue in the country of Myanmar, I think. And this has been brought out by the other two speakers as well, is that actually a lot of what we're seeing, the official actions, call it the Myanmar army or the Myanmar government, have a large amount of public support in Myanmar. So I think, the calculus is that this one is a political loser for her. Not only does she not feel empowered to antagonize the military, it would actually undercut her own position, her own popular position among the people and the voters of Myanmar. And again, in a sense, it could in fact be a way of shoring up her popularity and shoring up democracy, which is, of course, a fairly recent vintage. It's in Myanmar. It's only very recently that the army has, of course, allowed elections and has allowed Aung San Suu Kyi's party to come to power. And again, the calculation being, well, in a sense, if the Rohingya can be sacrificed in the interests of national unity, in the interests of democracy for the rest, that is, it appears, a price which the political leadership, including Aung San Suu Kyi, are willing to pay. Now, so on the one hand, while I say that I can understand that from the perspective of cold, hard political calculus, and certainly an unenviable position for her to be in, I think, nevertheless, from a moral perspective, it's unfortunate, and certainly we have here a Nobel laureate who had been lauded and lionized, certainly in the Western press, but I think it's fair to say all over the world. And one would have expected perhaps a stronger stand. I've written about this as well and said that and perhaps she could have tested her political capital to to take a stand on this particular issue. So while I understand the reasons behind the political leadership in Myanmar to take the stand they have taken, I don't think that translates to it being justified or the right thing to do.
Just to add to that as well, for those the audience who are not aware of this, in a lot of the South Asian countries, the military does play a major role in politics. But in Myanmar, it's actually one step further. 25% of the parliamentary seats are military based, so that's their rule. And if you want to make any major changes to laws, and I'm not sure on this, maybe the citizenship law, if that required to be changed, I think you need more than 75% votes, so you need the military on board. So if I'm correct on that, it's one of those institutionalized form of power of army in their democratic process. So that's something to keep in mind.
So both Fares and Zafar, you've both touched upon why the Rohingya are, being persecuted across different lands, across different nations. You touched upon higher leadership within Myanmar as, being thought of as someone who promotes peace across the world, now not only turning a blind eye to, but perhaps supporting, it's hard to say, what's going on to the Rohingya within Myanmar. So my question is, and this is for any of you, perhaps on a local level or on a cultural level, what fuels or continues to fuel the anti-Rohingya narrative within Myanmar? Considering, just like for us, you were talking about historically, there are reasons to have some kind of quarrels with these people because of alliances with Britain in the past. But today, what continues to fuel these anti-Rohingya narratives within Myanmar?
Shahira, your microphone is off and you're closer to the ground, so you may know a bit more about it, but I'm willing to chime in after you.
Yeah, so I was saying that social media is actually a really big factor. In my understanding, for a lot of the Rohingya community and people throughout Myanmar, as well as Bangladesh and many parts of South Asia, the internet is Facebook, and what you see on Facebook, and also I guess in the U.S. too. So what you see on Facebook is whatever is true, and there have been people, vested interests who have been using this platform in order to push an anti-Rohingya narrative, and so there have been false stories about violence, about the rape of Buddhist women, or forced marriages, that are disseminated through Facebook, through WhatsApp, and it goes to inflame emotions, and these stories are shared very rapidly. I think a couple of years ago, it was actually some military leaders were identified, as having accounts and using, Facebook accounts, I think not in their own name, to push these narratives. And so I think, any solution to this crisis and is actually going to, have to take into account, technology. And either using that platform in a different way to spread different kinds of stories, or regulating it.
I think that's a really interesting point you made with technology. Go ahead, Faraz. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, sorry. The social media is a big one. So I've been talking to some people in that area, and they're saying it's not social media with real news, it's social media with fake news, and then that's what's causing a lot of this. The other one that happened after September 11 is, or 2001, right? Is this whole crackdown on Muslims, or Islamic extremists? I shouldn't say Muslim, Islamic extremists, and the Burmese military and the ones who are, the nationalists, they actually grasp that, and they kind of now say a lot of the terrorist activities happens through the Rohingyas. And unfortunately, we did have the ARSA one. So for those of you who are not aware, ARSA stands for, I think, Arkan Rohingya Salvation Army. They have a local name as well. And they have been responsible for some attacks because they were saying, look, this persecution is going on for too long. Not justifying ARSA, I would not do that for any extreme group. But nonetheless, they got funding, or apparently they got funding from Pakistan, Saudi, and they have carried out some attacks inside. So that has also been used in the social media to say, oh, look, we have an extremist problem in our country as well, just like the rest of the world, just like Pakistan, just like USA, let's just look around. And we need to, this is coming from the Rohingya. So this has also been a big part. The other social media event is obviously, raping of Rakhine women or some version of that. Sometimes it happens, once or twice in any society, that kind of stuff happens. But it was blown out of proportion. And then the last one, and this might be on the edge of, I don't know, conspiracy theory versus not, but I'll just put it out anyways. There is a lot of talk about the military using the accounts example that Shahira was using, actually having computer areas, like areas where they sit and they just generate fake news. So not like some random person putting up something up on the web, but a concerted effort by parts of the military where they're actually disseminating made-up news. And if that is the case, you can imagine why it'd be so effective, especially when people are already primed to want and believe that.
There's also, I also want to mention, the rise of militant Buddhism. You've got these militant, Buddhist monks spreading hate. And there are examples in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, I think also in Thailand, and and in some cases, there have been links identified, between these monks and military leaders, kind of working in cahoots with each other. To spread the fake news, and also to vilify the Rohingya, to compare them to like insects and snakes. And so if you kill a Rohingya, it's not actually like killing a human being, because they're actually karmically, they're actually not the same as a human being. So I think that needs to be pointed out too. We have this idea in the US that the Buddhists are all very peaceful, and Muslims are the terrorists, and what's going on in the Rohingya crisis actually really flips that narrative on its head, and I feel like that's not pointed out enough.
Yeah, Shari, you just brought up Thailand, and in my research, if the situation couldn't get even more dire, in my research I found that in Thailand, there's a trafficking ring related to the Rohingya people. So can you talk a little bit about that, or anyone else that has knowledge about that? You're sorry, you're muted.
See, okay, I think I'm back on. Apologies for all my tech snafus. So you've got a lot of really desperate people in Bangladesh, living in camps. There are fences going on around the camps. They're, completely dependent on humanitarian aid for survival. They can't work. They don't have freedom of movement. They can't go to school. And the same. It's the same in the U.S. I'm sorry, not in the U.S. In Rakhine State. People live very, restricted lives in a kind of apartheid society. So they're so desperate that they fall victim to traffickers, right? In the spring, the Rohingya were in the news because of these boats, right? These boats that were out at sea for a couple of months, carrying hundreds of desperate, desperate Rohingya people who had been lured by traffickers with these false promises, and then they kept being turned back when they tried to dock in Malaysia, and I think maybe Thailand too, because of the fears of coronavirus. So the boats kept getting pushed away, and then and many people perish at sea. But as long as you have such uncertainty about their future and such restrictive conditions for them to be living in, for the Rohingya people to be living in Bangladesh, and also in Myanmar, then you have conditions that are going to lead to exploitation by traffickers. I don't know specifically about the group that you were speaking about in Thailand, but it's certainly not the only one. There are also trafficking groups in Bangladesh and in Rakhine, in Malaysia. It's a big business.
So to follow up on that, I wanted to ask Zafar one question about, we've been speaking about how the Rohingya are not only being accepted in either region, but they don't want to go to either region because they're not being granted rights, they're being persecuted, they're not being guaranteed any form of basic human necessities. So far, since you are there, I want to ask you, since you have kind of the sentiment of the people, why is Bangladesh resistant to accepting any more refugees?
Okay, I think to answer that question, we have to step back a little, a few decades. And one of the things which is regrettable and unfortunate in Bangladesh, and I mean, anyone who has been following the story of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh over the last few decades will have noticed this, is there is a actually great deal of prejudice and discrimination against the Rohingya community here in Bangladesh. And I think, it's very unfortunate that in a country where, Bangladeshis themselves, face similar narratives in reverse vis-a-vis India. But, wherever, I think in general, wherever you have a sort of a large mainstream majority population, we've seen this everywhere. Sort of anti-immigrant sentiment is very large, in certainly among certain groups of society. You see it in Europe, you see it in the US, you certainly see it in India against Bangladeshis. So it's kind of regrettable that Bangladeshis themselves would fall victim to this kind of prejudice, but we certainly are not immune to it. And so there had been, a lot of the narratives that you would see, again, unfortunately in the media, but also at the sort of the popular level. Well, Rohingyas are, they're criminals, they're drug dealers, this, that. And, that had been a low-level narrative throughout from the 1990s at least. That actually flipped around to some extent in 2017. Such was the atrocity of the ethnic cleansing that it actually changed public opinion here in Bangladesh, and there was a groundswell of sympathy for the Rohingya when they came in, because you saw, I think Faraz has mentioned this, we actually saw in real time, or there's videos, there's pictures of the persecution they were suffering. You had long lines of people coming into Bangladesh with just the clothes on their back, maybe a knapsack filled with what they could have salvaged from the burning or ransacking of their villages. That, of course, is it's about 3.5 years old, and I think unfortunately that sympathy has largely dissipated, and so we've kind of gone back to our default position, which isn't something that necessarily does the Bangladeshi public credit. I think, again, if you want to unpack it a little, there's certainly some resentment in the local community saying, well, these guys are here and they're getting all of this, they're getting all of this aid, they're getting all of this assistance, and of course, local communities feel that they're being left out. But my understanding is that international organizations, and even to the extent you have local NGOs who are working in the community, are working very hard to try and involve the local community and make sure that some of the, that a lot of the gains and a lot of the benefits do get shared by the local community. And so, for instance, we have the WFP, which provides food. They try and source a lot of that food to the extent that they can from local farmers. So I'm not sure, how accurate that complaint really is, but I think in some ways it's also fairly natural. Okay, and so this is, so you have this you have this problem. I think, the general consensus in Bangladesh is, we're a country of 165 million people. This is a country that, it's probably, for a country that size, it's the most densely populated country we have. Do we have the resources to support, 1 million Rohingya who've come in? Editorially at the Dhaka Tribune, we have said that, we think the best solution would be to allow them to work, to allow them freedom of movement. And, it doesn't necessarily mean that one has to grant them Bangladeshi citizenship, which in fact most Rohingya are not interested in, but certainly it allows them to participate fully in life. And we think that that would probably be the best solution, but for various reasons, the government is not on board with this. And I think they perhaps feel that, it would be both politically unfeasible as well as logistically a nightmare. And they don't want to create a situation which will, where there's, the sort of the moral hazard of allowing the Myanmar government to say, well, these guys are well settled in Bangladesh. I mean, I think it's, it's kind of a regrettable point of view. They think if they make things too easy for them here in Bangladesh, it undercuts the argument that ultimately they need to return to Rakhine. And I think there is a fair amount of resentment now building in Bangladesh, not so much against the Rohingya, but against the, the notion that, that Myanmar seems to kind of have gotten away with this, okay? And that, on the one hand, this is very much a Myanmar issue, but, no one seems to be doing much to hold either the Myanmar government or the army to account, whereas Bangladesh is getting a lot of criticism for not, and certainly there are steps which the Bangladeshi government could take to ameliorate the position of the refugees here in Bangladesh. But I think there's a feeling that that is, the disproportionate blame is devolved on Bangladesh. And I think the other feeling is that no other country in the world is at all, willing to take any large number of Rohingyas. You have offers here. Some people say we'll take a few hundred. Some people say we'll take a few thousand. But, when you have, in the recent exodus, it was 750,000. If you add it to the couple of 100,000 who are over there, I think the official count is 1.1 million. And so these are really a drop in the bucket. So I think that fuels a lot of the, a lot of the sentiment here in Bangladesh. It's a complicated situation.
So for a follow-up on that, a recent initiative is for Bangladesh to move a small number of the Rohingyas to an island called Bashan Char, which I think literally translates to floating island. So I wanted to get your thoughts on whether that will be a successful initiative, and also what do you think about the criticism of the island being a natural hazard because it's prone to hurricanes and things like that?
Well, again, this is a difficult situation. I mean, I think, sort of conventional wisdom, sort of conventional liberal wisdom is against this move. I have to say, having sent my reporters to Bhasanchar on more than one occasion and in speaking with them and in reading the reports they have come back, that, I don't actually think that, that it's necessarily as bad a plan as it has been reported, certainly in the Western media. The living conditions certainly are far better than you see in the refugee camps. There is an issue of to what extent are people being moved there voluntarily and to what extent are they being moved there involuntarily, which is perhaps an issue. But I do think it is not out of bounds for the Bangladeshi government to say, well, look, if we have to host this population, we think, for various reasons, it makes more sense for us to host them here. I think the reports of the island being uninhabitable and, sort of prone to cyclones and hurricanes have been overblown. From what I have seen and when I speak to people about it, it's not perfect. And I understand that some people may not like to be moved further away from their homeland. So the closer they are to the border, the more comfortable they feel. But I think it's not out of bounds for the Bangladeshi government to try and, take this position. I mean, I think the ultimate thing we also have to understand is we shouldn't get sidetracked by the discussion of Bhashan Chor, because at the end of the day, it's more or less a sideshow. We're talking a maximum capacity of about 100,000 people. There's still going to be 1 million people left in the in the camps.
Wow.
In the camps in and around the Cox's Bazar area. So, you know, that's something which one needs to also take into consideration. Now, that may be something Shahira and Faraz disagree with, but that's fine.
I don't completely disagree. As an academic, you learn never to completely ever disagree, because there's always two sides to a story. I do want to add a few things first in terms of the local resentment, and then come to this aspect of Bhashan Chor. So I think in terms of local resentment, the few things that got a lot of limelight and got a lot of people worried is the whole connection with Yaba and drug trafficking, which became a big thing in Dhaka for a while. So people like connecting dots that are simple and straight lines. So even though it's not just, hey, a group of migrants came and they bought the whole drug into the country and it's spreading all over and it's all their fault. In a way, that's how it was marketed. And so just like we are talking about in Myanmar, you have a lot of these fake news is being popped up. A lot of that is happening in Bangladesh as well. So you have to keep that in mind. And then the second thing, and there's some studies being done right now, is local food prices in the areas that they're in Bangladesh is actually going up. So when you're thinking of rice, when you're thinking of grains that the World Food Program is bringing in, prices are not being affected because they're coming from abroad, imported and going straight into the refugee camps. But when you're thinking of local vegetables, fruits, other kind of food products that are locally grown and are not being flown into the refugee camp, those prices are being affected, and local people, I can understand why they wouldn't be too happy about it. In terms of thinking about, you know, the history of the world and migration in general, forced migration in general, I think only 1 to 0.5% of people actually get settled in the country that they go to, or become integrated into the country in terms of citizenship rights and that kind of stuff. So there's really not a good reason to all of a sudden expect, like, why isn't Bangladesh different? I mean, we are all proud Bangladeshis in some shape or form, but when you're kind of working against the statistics of 99% of countries or refugees don't get citizenship locally, I don't understand why we should feel like Bangladesh should understand it better. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out. The other thing that if you look at the literature of integrating migrants into the society, so it sounds really good, but most of these studies are done in high-income countries. And in high-income countries, whether it be Europe or US, you have a bunch of studies that kind of say, look, if you let the immigrants in and you assimilate them, you give them citizenship, or you give them a pathway to citizenship, they're going to be productive members of the society. But you need to stop and remember, we are now talking about low-income and middle-income countries. The realities there are very, very, very different. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to assimilate them. I'm just pointing out that it's a different kind of a setup. There, the studies are not as strong as in, oh, integrate them, it's going to work out. And that might be because of two reasons. One, fundamentally, these are different kinds of economies. They're already resource poor, so they're having to work with that. And the second piece, enough studies are just not done. You don't have good data for these countries. So not enough studies have been done. So we are kind of somewhat uncertain about this. And a fact that a lot of people don't recognize, 85% of the people who are displaced internationally are actually in low-income countries or middle-income countries. So the 15% goes to the high-income countries, but most of them are not there. So if you think along those lines, I mean, Bangladesh is not the exception. We want us to be an exceptional country, but they're not the exception. They're very much with the rule. The other aspect that people sometimes point out on the other direction is, hey, it's a big population, 1 million for a country like Bangladesh. If you really look at the numbers of number of forced immigrants per 1,000 individuals in a household, Bangladesh doesn't even fall into the first 20 countries. Okay, because we have such a big population, 1 million people doesn't convert to a big number of per person or per 1,000 population. So in that sense also, I think maybe integrating them would not be that difficult, but I just think historically that there's not a whole lot of precedence for that. And in terms of Bhashan Chor, I respectfully mostly disagree with the idea that, you know, it's 100,000 people, it's a sideshow. 100,000 people is a lot of people. And if we look into, you know, we talk about this in a few months or a few years, maybe Bangladesh at the end of the day will end up with 100,000 people from this Rohingya refugees. Probably a lot of them will be repatriated. A lot of them might move on to other countries. Repatriation seems like something that has happened historically. Hopefully it doesn't happen, because I don't see how things will be any better if they get repatriated. But 100,000 might be the people that we end up with into the future. And they're kind of disconnected from the economy, right? They're in this island. If you want to assimilate them, keep them in the mainland, assimilate them across the country, as opposed to kind of doing the same thing that Myanmar did. Here's Rakhine, you guys stay there. And oh, by the way, you are going to be the poorest region of our country. You're going to have the highest amount of COVID-19. Everything bad is going to happen in this particular region because you're all concentrated there. So that's my worry of putting a lot of these Rohingya refugees in one place and then saying, oh, that's that place. They're the other. And we don't have to give them the same services as we do to the rest of the country. So that's a worry. In terms of the point that Zafar said, that the situation is not as bad as it is being overblown in the media, I do agree that some of the things that people are saying is not cool. Last thing before I finish up, a lot of those individuals who were moved there initially were lied to. So they were told that you're going to go there, within a few weeks you're going to come back and you reunite with your family. That's kind of forced, and that's lying, literally. So if voluntarily they want to move, I have no issue with that. But I think there was a bit of trickery there, and some human rights was seriously violated, which we need to kind of keep in mind. Sorry, I know I've been speaking quite a bit there.
No worries at all. All constructive talk. Thank you. So, we've all talked about nationalism and the dangers of it. I think comparisons can be made across the world, whether you're talking about Hindu nationalism, whether you're talking about the recent events within the United States with the attacks on the Capitol, and the fact that even though we have a new president, we still have a lot of the same sentiments that exist among many American citizens. So nationalism is something that I think needs to be respectfully feared. And so my question is, and maybe for Shahira, but really for anyone, despite the UN's warning about an unfolding genocide in Myanmar, why has the UN not placed more pressure on them in regards to the situation?
That is, that's a question on everybody's mind, right? And it's certainly the question that the foreign minister, our honorable foreign minister of Bangladesh, is constantly posing as well. I mean, what teeth does the UN really have? What can the UN really do in these circumstances? I mean, what are the pressure tactics? And I think you also have to look at it from a couple of different angles. I mean, Myanmar can say, yes, we will, take back all of the Rohingya that can be verified. But what they're not saying is that they will grant them the rights, including citizenship, that the Rohingya community is now asking for. And I think that what's different now compared to previous influxes and repatriations is that you have a community that is more vocal and more empowered, and has more of the world's attention than ever before. And so you have leaders coming out of the Rohingya community who are very vocally advocating for what they see as the rights that they are entitled to, that any citizen in any country around the world should be entitled to. And that includes really simple things like the right to education past class 10, the right to get married without having to pay a high tax, freedom of movement. There's so many restrictions. I mean, there's just like so many restrictions on Rohingya people who don't have citizenship, and they don't have. I mean, there's so many things that they don't have access to because they don't have citizenship. That they're saying, forget it. We're not going to go back unless you can guarantee us that we're going to be safe, that this violence is not going to happen. No more pogroms, as have been happening systematically. Every decade, or I think the pace, in recent years has been even, quicker than that. 2012, 2016, and then 2017. So basically, it's what we're looking at is a problem that has many dimensions and seems very intractable because the stakeholders, you can't get the stakeholders to agree. And with China refusing to put any pressure on Myanmar, or allow for a censure, that takes away a lot of and it takes away whatever kind of teeth that the UN might have. And then you also have to consider that there are also Rohingya people living in Rakhine right now, and so there's a bit of a dance between UN and other aid agency operations in Myanmar and those in Bangladesh, because we don't want anything that we say or do here to actually put people at risk over there. And so we have to be careful, to walk a line and not to be too critical of the government in Myanmar, because that can actually result in retaliation. So it's kind of a big chess game. And the Rohingya people are, they're in the middle of it. They don't have, it's like they don't have representation on the board, but they're just victims of this game of strategy that all these other stakeholders are playing.
Thanks for that. One thing I just want to say to Faraz, first, I think it's great you are disagreeing, because I think it's really important to see all sides. And I think we were very conscious of that when putting this event together, to get people with diverse backgrounds. For Zafar, I'm glad you spoke about the perspective from Bangladesh, because it's not an easy decision. It's a lot of people. Bangladesh has a lot of problems themselves, as we know. They have a lot of people to feed. It's not an easy decision to turn away people. I'm glad you spoke about that. And Faraz, you spoke about how it's not all Myanmar, people in Myanmar that hate, that dislike Rohingya. I'm sure there's plenty of people in Myanmar that want to help, the Rohingya, but it's the government or it's the army. So I think it's great that we have all these perspectives, on the call. I researched where the Rohingya are going, and I was surprised to see that there's actually a large number of Rohingya in the United States, close to 12,000. I wanted to know if you are aware of any programs going on in the United States to help the Rohingya assimilate here, or if you have any idea of where they are in the United States. And that's open to anyone.
So I think the largest community is actually in Milwaukee. And then there's another big community in Chicago. You have communities in Dallas and Houston. Also in the Atlanta area. So there are pockets here and there. And what tends to happen with refugee resettlement is, if you've got a few families, if it's known that there are a few families in one place, then other people coming from that country will go there, where they know that there is a community, at least a small community that's established. There are Rohingya community centers I think probably the best known one is in Chicago. They have an online presence. There are a lot of education and literacy activities. I think that's so literacy activities, education, and also health promotion to help Rohingya people who have actually settled there quite recently. I mean, I think it's mostly within the last 10 years that the bulk of people have been, the bulk of Rohingya refugees have been resettled in the United States. And so, it's still that first generation, right? People are learning English. They're getting citizenship. And they are, they're starting to become empowered, but there hasn't yet emerged, a strong, vocal diasporic community in the U.S. It's starting to emerge, but you have a lot of young people, that are in school, in high school, or just going to university right now, and so it's kind of so the Rohingya community in the U.S. I think is in a bit of an embryonic, state in terms of advocating for themselves. I think we'll start to see that change. It is starting to change, and more community groups are emerging and beginning to link with each other, and kind of trying to create one voice in terms of advocacy and programs, but it's still in the beginning stages.
And I want to very quickly add something to that. US has kind of cut down on immigration to the US over the last 4 years. And most of you are thinking Trump administration, and that is correct. So I believe in terms of assimilating refugees, international refugees into high income countries, the data is very strong. There's lots of studies done. They assimilate pretty fast and they contribute to the society pretty well as well. So I would say this is the time US should probably step up. I mean, Europe dealt with a lot of the Syrian refugees. US was going through its own political issues, so didn't really bring in a lot of refugees. I think this is a very crucial time for the US, for the activists to kind of really activate, because they are trying to repatriate a bunch of Rohingya refugees back by June and I'm really worried about that. I think this is the time. The good news is, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the Biden administration is looking into it as we speak. I think it was like 2 days before they formed a task force who is looking into whether this is ethnic cleansing and what to do about it. I'm hoping there will be some good that comes out of it. And one thing I do want to remind everybody in terms of the United Nations Security Council, it's not always China. Russia is right there with you. I love Russia, my Russian friends, but those two countries are both opposing anything being done about this.
So when you mentioned which national powers need to come to the table and start creating some concrete action, and this is for everyone, all our panelists, just as we finish up our conversation tonight or this morning, which groups exist today that are supporting the Rohingya, and how can our audience members or anyone get involved with these groups? How can we try to support, spread not only the message, but try to create some form of action that'll have a lasting impact?
So there are, of course, the UN agencies and big international, organizations with a presence on the ground here. You've got, Save the Children and Oxfam and Mercy Corps. WFP is providing food. I work for the International Organization of Migration. There's UNHCR. But I would say, I would actually say that the most effective way to act and to have an impact is actually locally. So, look for, if you want to get involved, try to find organizations in your community. Maybe there is a Rohingya Community Center or a refugee resettlement agency. Call, see if there are volunteer opportunities. You can donate to them. You can get involved with, literacy programs. Volunteer as a teacher. And faith-based organizations are also, I think, are in a lot of ways faith organizations, whether churches or mosques or organizations like Islamic Relief or Zakat. I think it's Zakat International. They're more effective at getting the money, getting the services directly to the people who need it the most. Without big swaths of it getting funneled into salaries and administrative costs, and I think that you see that a lot in the UN in particular. So act locally if you can. Write to your congressman. As Faraz was saying, it looks like the Biden administration is going to be doing a review, and may come to a decision about whether this actually qualifies as a genocide. So, yeah, write to your congressman. Put some pressure that way, and also try to educate yourself. Research, get involved, learn as much as you can, so that you can become an informed advocate.
Just to quickly add to that, generally, when you have refugee camps, you have the big organizations working there. So United Nations, HCR, for example, CARE and Oxfam. And oftentimes the smaller NGOs in the area don't have access It's just, legally they cannot, or the government stops them from doing that. But now that they are kind of moving to Bhashanchar and they're slightly kind of getting outside the realm of the refugee camps, some of these other NGOs that we know in Bangladesh, like BRAC and like the big ones who have capacity building abilities, I think they are going to become much more useful. We'll have to wait and see where these individuals move to. So if they stay in Bangladesh, I think some of those local NGOs will become much more useful. But if they start traveling back or they move to other areas or they're kept inside the refugee camps, I think we need to kind of think about that as well. And as far as, I work for Nourish Bangladesh, I had to say that name out there at some point. But we work with feeding. But one thing we've heard about the refugee camp is food, like your lentils and rice and potato. That is less of an issue now. But much more of an issue is education for children, health related stuff. So those are the big ones. So I would say not everybody can become an activist. You can definitely put some pressure on your congressman, for example, but you could donate. And when you donate, I think one thing you should do is do your research. Don't just donate. So don't do I know a big name, I'll just throw some money there and that's it. So do your research and see what kind of work they're doing. And I think education and health are going to be the two big ones. And human rights is one of those weird ones, like, that there's a lot of need, but NGOs oftentimes don't have the power to do a whole lot there. But nonetheless, that is obviously one of the biggest one.
So go ahead, Shahir.
I also wanted to mention an organization that I have been working with, that my project, the Cultural Memory Center, has been working with. It's a small organization called Books Unbound, and what they have been doing is creating literacy materials, culturally appropriate literacy materials for Rohingya refugees. And the person who is the founder of the organization, she was working in Thailand at a temporary holding center there, where she met Rohingya refugees in 2015, and she was running literacy programs, and there just weren't any materials that were appropriate for that community. And one of the challenges about literacy, about doing literacy with the Rohingya, is that the Rohingya language is an oral language. So that means there's no standard script, there's no dictionary, and there's often a lot of disagreement about what something is called, or how it's pronounced, or how it's spelled. And so creating tools, creating a standard set of tools that are contextualized for the use of the community is actually a really, really, really urgent endeavor. If we're going to actually be empowering the community, so that they can start to take leadership and start to take the future in their own hands. In the camps in Cox's Bazar, it's about 30% literacy. Most people, they can't read and write, and even when they can, it's very, very basic. A lot of the refugees who have been resettled in the U.S., it's the same thing. And so you have mothers, trying to help kids with their homework, or even try to teach them, forget about English, but try to teach them their own language, and there aren't the tools to do that. And so education, I think, we've said it before, and almost everybody that I talk to in the community, especially youth advocates, they identify education as being one of the biggest priorities for action going forward. So anyway, that was a shout out to Books Unbound as an organization that you could donate to.
So after this this panel discussion, so that we will post this on our social media pages, as well as bangalisofnewyork.com, and perhaps even Asana's website, and we will list all of those organizations that we research as well, and we'll add Books Unbound and of course Nourish to that list, and that will be available, and it will also post that with our social.
All right, everyone, I think we will wrap up our discussion for this evening. Certainly 1 hour or however long we've spent together doesn't begin to address this issue. It's just opening the door for so many of our audience members into what this is about. And for folks who are well versed in this issue, I think they still took something away from this evening with hearing different perspectives. So thanks to everyone here for being here. Thanks, Cameron, for helping moderate. And thank you to all three panelists, Shahira, Zafar, Fares, for being here tonight. We really appreciate your time. Go ahead, Cameron.
Yeah, I just want to say, if you all have any closing remarks for people, feel free to, say them.
I'll go ahead and say something. If you ever wanted to do some good, this is as good a time as any. So help the Rohingya refugees out by being an activist, or help fight COVID, or help fight hunger. Do whatever you want to do. But if 2020 did not get you activated, I don't know what will. It's never too late. Please go do your good deed. This is the right time. Thank you.
So I would like to thank you for hosting this panel. And I would also like to say that it can be it can be easy to get discouraged when you look at the scale of this problem, and just how stubborn the problem seems, how difficult it seems to solve. And I think that what we have to do, as individuals going up against these enormous global issues that are challenging us right now, is really kind of, scale ourselves to, what we as individuals can accomplish, and think in those terms. Right here, we're not going to be, figuring out the solution for 1.1 million Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar, but maybe you can adopt a Rohingya family through an organization in your community, and help make sure that their healthcare costs are paid, whether it's a family in the U.S. or it's a family in the camps in Cox's Bazar. Whatever you can do, whatever your capability is, it's enough. It's enough, and it makes a difference. We're all part of a chain of transformation.
And if I could just say in conclusion that I'm presuming that the bulk of the audience here is in the US, where this is for their consumption. I think you've taken a great first step, those of you who are actually tuning in, to educate yourself. And what Shahira and Faraz have said, I would like to sort of amplify that, read up, educate yourself, become involved. And I think the wonderful thing about this new year in 2021, Shahira has also mentioned this, and I think Faraz as well, is that the incoming administration has signaled that it really wants to take another closer look at the issue of the Rohingya. There's going to be a study done on whether the activity of the Myanmar army, rises to the level constitutes genocide. The fact that they're, even using that word in this context is, I think, very significant. And I think what we're really seeing, and what we're all hopeful for, those of us around the world, I'm here in Bangladesh, is that we see a greater engagement, or the possibility of a greater engagement with the rest of the world from the United States. And that once again, I think the US, certainly at a governmental level, is going to try and, engage with the world in a way which perhaps it has not done in the last 4 years. And I think that also opens doors and avenues for the average person living in the US to become more involved, more active. So I'll just leave it at that.
I think a common theme is that this is the year that should spark everyone to create some kind of change. It's been a trialing year for most, if not everyone, but I hope that tonight's conversation can give you some perspective into how big or small your problems are, and how that the rest of the world continues to have their own set of problems. So hopefully after hearing some of today's discussion, you'll choose to become more involved in whatever avenue some form of goodness and change has in your life. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Thanks again to our panelists. Wherever you are in the world, hope you have a good night. Hope you have a good day. And we'll see you again next time.